Today I wanted to get into a little bit of kind of a review of 2021, if you will. Kind of talk about some of the issues that came across my desk during the last season. Of course, I'm out in Minot in the crop protection office there. When I think back of 2021, I guess in the crop protection umbrella, I think about plant disease and that of entomology. When I think back the last year, I'm not sure I really took any calls on the plant disease side. So I guess today you're going to get an extension of the entomology block here with these updates here. Some of the pests that did come across my desk, and I'm going to hit a few of them, are going to include some of those that came in. You know, wireworms, cutworms, and if I'm honest, grasshoppers really dominated the scene this last year, probably along with the lines of blister beetles as well. So let's go ahead and get started into some of these. First is going to be the cutworm. The cutworm was an early season pest. Going back through my notes, some of those calls came in fairly early. We're really impacted by just a few species of cutworm in the area. Two of them that I wanted to talk about today, pale western cutworm, and then that of the army cutworm. If we first start with the pale western cutworm, of course, that adult, light gray in coloration for those forewings and definite markings on those wings. That larvae, of course, part of the damaging part of that life cycle, hairless, body is pale gray to greenish gray in color. Oftentimes it'll be associated with that yellow-brown head. Then we have that of the army cutworm, okay? The army cutworm, dark again in color, gray-brown forewings, a few distinct markings. Of course, I always think of that kidney-shaped bean on the backside of that forewing. Oftentimes the hindwings will have light gray to brown with fringe on those wings. Again, back to the damaging part of the life cycle, green to black in color with some alternating stripes, usually dark colors in orange with some pale white lines down the back. Let's get a little bit deeper into the life cycle. Some of these cutworms have an interesting life cycle. Overall, the pale western life cycle is really one of those that overwinter in the egg stage. It's traditionally in the upper 1 centimeter of the soil surface and will give way to hatch in the spring as those temperatures begin to warm. It's hard to believe temperatures are beginning to warm up so rapidly now, but something just in a few weeks might be something we're talking about. Of course, after their activity, they'll go into the pupate stage, and oftentimes we only observe one generation per year. Our hosts, small grains, our wheats, our oats, our barleys. Of course, some of those secondary host plants, canola, field pea, and some of those legumes. Of course, we have some of those different weeds in the area that can also serve as a host plant for the pale western cutworm. As those eggs begin to hatch, of course, we have that first instar, that emerging larvae. This will traditionally feed on the surface of emerging shoots and can result in furrowed leaves at those tips of those younger plants. Of course, as they begin to mature, they become big enough, they can actually sever some of those crops at the just below the soil level. We always talk about in entomology, scouting, part of that IPM toolbox, so monitoring is going to be key. Of course, check for presence of gaps within the rows. I do have to asterisk that a little bit. Gaps doesn't always mean cutworms are in the area. There could be other issues, some of those physical attributes. I always think about some issues that could occur with the planter from time to time. So if you do come across some of those gaps, it's just a signal to do a little bit more investigation. Oftentimes, if you have some of those weed-free sites during the fall, less weeds, this is a less attractive area for those adults to lay eggs and can be a benefit to you as you get in the springtime. For our cutworms, the small grains economic threshold's about 4 to 5 larvae per square foot. Next, we'll get to the army cutworm. This one will actually overwinter as a partially grown larvae as compared to pale western as the egg stage. Of course, adults will begin laying eggs August to October in some of those weedy field sites or in field sites where winter wheat has been planted. Of course, they'll hatch in the fall and be active, feeding on some of the local vegetation. At least until you get to the time period as cold sets in, that soil will begin to freeze and that development will begin to cease. They will remain active until the spring with those warmer temperatures, again resuming on some of that vegetation, especially to those newly emerging plants. Adults will emerge in late June, and again, one generation per year. In many retrospects, similar hosts are cereal crops being listed there, alfalfa, corn, flax, and various weeds can also be tied into some of those hosts. Army cutworm, some of those larvae, of course, some of our climbing cutworms, they can come up, graze on some of those leaves. Of course, early season pests. But one of the interesting things, as those food sources deplete, they'll begin to move, and they can move in large masses, hence the name army, moving in that large mass kind of retrospect. Again, monitoring is going to be key. Detection and control while they're small can help protect some of those yield loss results later on in the season. Look for small holes in the leaves or even missing plant tips when they're younger. Search for the larvae, 3 to 4 inches of the soil at that soil line. And of course, think about when they're active. They can be more active, visible on those plants at the base, really on cloudy days or as you get to the late afternoon and evening time periods. Again, like we saw with the pale western cutworm, 4 to 5 larvae per square foot of row for that economic threshold. There are a couple other species of cutworm found in the state. We're not going to touch on those really today, but dingy cutworm and the red-backed cutworm, 2 of those other species common in North Dakota. If you have to fall to control of cutworm, always remember to follow the label. Best time to spray, oftentimes in the evening or those cloudy days when they're the most active. If you're thinking about the army cutworm, it may be to your benefit, especially as they begin to migrate from those small grains into some of those later crops, to think about forming a barrier strip. You can do that with 2 to 3 swats, movement in the direction that that mass seems to be moving. And if needed, always refer to the North Dakota Field Crop Management Guide if chemical control is needed. Next, I want to get into wireworm. This is one of those other early season pests that tend to show up any given year. I know they showed up again in the Renville County area this last year to some of those growers. Obviously, description, hard, smooth, slender, almost wire-like in appearance. As it begins to reach full maturity in that immature stage, about 1.5 inches to 2 inches long. Okay? Yellow, white, almost a coppery type of color is often that recognizable characteristic, with 3 pairs of small, thin legs behind the head. As we get to that adult, of course, you get that hard-shelled body. Tends to be a dark color in appearance, often those dark browns to a dark black. Typically about 1/2 inch long. Of course, the adult version of this is what we call the click beetle because of how some of the sounds it makes when it interacts in that environment in which it's situated. This has a very unusual type of life cycle. For many insects, we talk about a single growing season, but the wireworm gets to actually have that life cycle that's more extended. You can see 3 to 4 years going to full maturity from the egg stage to the adult. Most of this part of the life cycle is actually spent as the larvae in that damaging type of stage. And the other thing, generation overlap. It's not that you'll go into some of your baiting traps and find just the larvae from this year. It's possible to have multiple years worth of larvae at one site. So you'll have some that are a little bit bigger, some that are a little bit smaller, and they'll all be intermixed. They will overwinter as both adults and larvae, typically within 9 to 24 inches of the soil surface, really seeking to get away from those cooler temperatures. As we begin to warm, that adults, those larvae will begin to become more active and they'll start climbing in the soil profile. Larvae will move up and down throughout the growing season in response to temperature and moisture. Typically 50 to 80 degrees is going to be some of that favorable conditions. But as mentioned, we'll move up and down as needed for more favorable conditions. Wireworm actually impacts many different crops, and not just our small grains, which is a very common pest, but corn, potato, sunflower, just to name a few of the other ones that which it can impact. Grassy areas can also serve as an egg-laying site, so depending on what type of rotation you might be using, it may be something to think about reflecting back on your field history. Of course, if that rotation looked at a pasture or grassland the following year, just something more to increase some of that observation or scouting protocols. Typically, damage occurs by feeding on the germinating seed or those young plants, which could result in thinning stands as those plants could begin to wilt and die off. Control of wireworms is one of the interesting ones. Once the plants are in the ground, seed is beginning to grow, there's really no rescue treatment available. So you really have to reflect back on field history and having that plan made before chemicals are used. Obviously, seed treatments are available, but on a year-to-year basis, infestations are going to vary in how severe they are. And understanding the severity in any given year is really going to depend on some of your sampling that will be needed each year. There's really two forms of sampling that could be used. One of them is a bait trap. Here you can see a diagram kind of showing off what the bait trap could look like. Of course, establish this in the fall, 2 to 3 weeks before freeze. Place randomly throughout the field in several different area field sites. Try to be representative of what the field looks like. Of course, you're going to dig out that hole. Oftentimes I use a cup cutter, get about 4 to 6 inches in depth. After you have that cup cut out, a cup mixture of both wheat and shelled corn could be used kind of as that lure for that bait trap. Of course, you're going to take a plastic cover up that hole. Oftentimes I use the addition of flags. I can pierce that cover just to the side of either trap, help hold it in place. As we all know, North Dakota is kind of a windy place to be. Oftentimes I'll bring that trowel, fill in dirt around that trap as well. Of course, a few weeks later, we'll come back in, monitor what we're finding. If we're at an average in your field site of 1 or more larvae, this will justify a possible treatment the following growing season. The other method of sampling could include soil sampling. Here you can see 20 well-spaced 1-foot sites to a depth of 4 to 6 inches. Of course, as you soil sample, again, that one average of 1 or more per square foot can justify treatment. I always like to utilize this chart to help think about what type of risk damage you may have at a field site and when treatment may or may not be warranted. So of course, 0, low, no treatment necessary, 0 to 1, getting to moderate, possible treatment. But then if you get down to the bottom row of this chart, you see 4 or more. Extreme possible risk of economic damage with the possibility of extreme methods being needed. Well, what could some of those methods be? It could be using the highest level of neonicotinoid insecticide treatment on the label. Increasing seeding could be another one. Or shifting to a legume type of plant, a crop that's a little bit less likely to show damage overall. Again, always think about what type of treatment might be available to you. Just a couple of the more common ones that are utilized by many growers, thiamethoxam, cruiser, those insecticide seed treatments can be utilized. Always refer to that label of any pre-harvest intervals or other restrictions that may be attached to some of these chemicals. I know Dr. Canolo referred to this a little bit earlier, some of those new chemistries that are now out for wireworm control, and you can see one of those here. Of course, we have BASF looking at Prochaska. These are registered for most of our small grains, wheats, barleys, triticale, and rye. Of course, group 30, metadiamine type of insecticide. You can see only used for wireworms on that label, so for use on commercial and on-farm use, at about a fluid rate of 0.26 fluid ounces per 100 pounds of seed. There's also another variety or combination of that, Prochaska F4. This is that insecticide with 4 fungicides included within that. You can see that 4.6 fluid ounces per 100 pounds of seed rate listed there. This includes some of those fungicides to help protect some of those diseases as noted on the label. So here you get that benefit of a fungicide and a insecticide combination. Dr. Canolo's lab, along with her lead research technician, Patrick Bozet, actually put this in the ground here over the last couple years. You can see 2019 data being used here. This was at a field site near Mulhall, North Dakota. Of course, you can see our untreated check. You can see plants per acre, bushels per acre on that other axis, and of course the number of wireworms being determined at those locations. First see 3 wireworms within that untreated check. As we move across, the one that really is going to stand out is that Prochaska plus that fungicide insecticide seed treatment. Of course, you see that improvement, just over 900,000 plants per acre with that combination. You can see the protection of the yield that helped give 28.2 bushels per acre. Some of these other treatments, you see the fungicide a little bit lower. So we're seeing a little bit of a benefit there with that Prochaska and that fungicide. Another one of those possible new chemistries out on the market here recently from Corteva Agriscience, you see Lumivia, a seed treatment being noted there, group 28 diamide. This is registered for both wheat and triticale, and this actually has a little bit more expanded usage for some of those early season insects, cutworms, armyworm, seed corn maggot, and wireworms, all possibilities for registration under this new insecticide seed treatment. Where would I be if I didn't hit up on grasshoppers today? This was a big deal across much of north central and northwest North Dakota over the last year. Here you can see some of the common species here in the northern parts of the state. Of course, differential grasshopper, migratory, and red-legged. When I think about on a normal year, I would expect egg hatch, begin late April and go into the early part of May. Peak hatch really wrapping up as you get to mid-June. Warmer temperatures last year kind of allowed observations to begin a little bit earlier than we're more accustomed to. As you can see, heavy infestations during years of drought, areas of low rainfall, typically preceded by several years of hot, dry summers. If we could get to help control the weather, if we had that wonderful gift, none of us do, but some of that cold, wet weather can help delay development of grasshoppers, slow that development rate, even allow some diseases to go through some of those populations when that moisture is present. I always like to reflect on some of the cultural control methods that are available to you when it comes to grasshopper control. Of course, early seeding, depending on that environment you're in, if that weather is going to allow you to do so, can allow you to get that plant established and allow vigorous plant growth to help be another factor in that defense system. I always reflect back on this photo, this of course coming out of southwest Pierre, South Dakota. You can see the impact the grasshoppers really had on those sunflowers. It almost took all the leaf tissue off of those plants. Of course, beside it, I see some of those soybean plants being planted beside it. When you think about crop rotation, always think about that field history. Of course, fields with more of that late maturing crops can be more of a beneficial to some of those egg-laying sites. So that can increase some of those eggs for the next growing season. In areas where applicable, of course, we're coming out of a severe drought. Tillage may not really be the control factor we want to fall back to this next year, but in some cases, that can help reduce successful emergence of nymphs as we work our time into the spring. Economic threshold is always one of the key things to consider for control. And I know I talked to a lot of growers in the area from northwestern to the north central about the impact or the population levels of grasshoppers this last year. And sometimes it can be a little bit difficult to estimate the population you have at your field site. So oftentimes we think about using the 15-inch diameter sweep net. Of course, for 100-degree sweeps is that equivalent of about 1 square yard. When we think about economic threshold, we always reflect on that threatening level. Of course, you can see nymphs per square yard, adults per square yard, so 50 or more at the field margins, 30 or more for nymphs within the center of the field will justify a chemical application to be needed. This allows me to fall into the clutches of some of the data from the IPM scouting program this last year. When I first look at this, you can see all the locations over the year that many of our scouts covered and traversed across North Dakota. Of course, a lot of these seem a little bit younger or lower in appearance, if you will, and some of us know there were other sites that were pretty critical in terms of population. 3 of those connections occur, as you can see by these stars. So we had one outside of Granora. I remember a grower sending me a photo of a fence post, and there was solid grasshoppers top to bottom. In fact, you couldn't even recognize that fence post being there. Of course, in that area, that grower actually made a couple insecticide applications there as he breached economic threshold several times throughout the growing season. 2 other areas that I can note, higher grasshopper numbers, again, McCody, Ryder, Plaza area. And then I know a report came into the Extension Entomology Office this year between Sawyer and Logan. In that area, they're reporting adult grasshoppers clipping the heads of some of those small grain plants. So we had our areas, it was high throughout the state, but we had some of those more critical areas that popped up in more localized locations. There is a new insecticide. I know Dr. Kanoto brought Vantacor up in her presentation as well. This particular one of those group 28 insecticides for Vantacor, registered for uses in multiple types of crops: wheat, triticale, oats, barley, to name a few. Some broadleaf crops as well: sunflower, soybean. These can be used for many of our lepidopteran pests, as well as Colorado potato beetle and that of grasshoppers. It is important to note for grasshoppers that use of that MSO adjuvant, and this is really going to target some of those mid to older instars for the nymphs. Her team was able to put this into the ground in Castleton over this last year, evaluate what its impact really can look like. You can see some of those treatments on the x-axis, of course, are untreated control, kind of a low dose rate of Vanagor, 1.2 fluid ounces, and then that high rate of Vanacor, as well as the two common chemistries used for control throughout the state for grasshoppers. Of course, grasshoppers per square yard, untreated check. Day 4 in blue, day 9 in orange. You can see about 4 to 5 per square yard being noted. You can see a reduction occurring in many of these treatments, really getting from 1 to about 3. Looking at some of these day 4 evaluations, some of those significant differences of about 1. Cobalt and Warrior showing some of that similar return, especially at day 4. In 2020, another grasshopper evaluation done at Castleton by Dr. Knodl's lab. You can see some of the common chemistries across that x-axis. So you see a high dosage, low dosage of Asana. You see the Brigade high and low, Cobalt high and low, Hero, Mustang, Max, Warrior, before you get to that overall untreated check. You can see at the top some of the responses for bushels per acre, in blue, percent defoliation, and in gold, grasshoppers per square yard. Some of the things, I see kind of a similar trend here. One, you see the protection in terms of percent defoliation go from about 25% to about 15% or less in many cases. We also see that response in terms of the level for yield protection, mid-20s bushels per acre for that untreated check, and we can get to about the mid-30s to right around 40 for many of those treatments. I always want to leave off with a few beneficials. I know when I've come out here to Williston, I always get some questions about the common beneficials in the area. So how could I leave this off this presentation? There are many different beneficials really that are found throughout the environment across not just North Dakota, but really across the world. I always love to use this graphic, one of those that Dr. Knodl came together, kind of shows you the tools and the resources to your disposal when you think about the IPM scouting protocols. Today, I'm going to focus right here on biological control. Some of those biological controls I want to introduce to you, if you will. First of all, there are two different information packets out there. We have our brand new one from NDSU Extension, touching base on some of those common natural enemies, what kind of locations they're found, and the impact they can have in our different crops. There's a similar info packet coming out from the Xerces Society that gets pretty detailed in some of those that are found in North America and across the U.S. So I wanted to touch base on a few of the three more common ones here in North Dakota. And one of the observations I made since I've arrived here about 6 years ago was the high population we have of lacewings, really specifically the green lacewing. So here you can see the adult green lacewing. Of course, the brown one is just a little bit smaller. You can see about 40 days development time. You know, Dr. Knodl brought up, 5 days turnover for a generation for some of those aphids that in her presentation. So, 5 days versus 40, you're seeing a kind of a split there in that impact that they can have. Look at some of the different types of prey that they can feed on. They can be truly beneficial at a field site. I know in some of my readings, these are pretty ferocious predators. I see aphids there. Up to 400 aphids per week can be consumed by some of these lacewings overall. One of the more common ones that everyone seems to be familiar with is ladybugs. Not quite 500 species across the United States. You can see about a month and a half developmental time with 3 generations per year. I always like to show off this photo, show you the different color schemes that we can really hold. Oftentimes we understand the red with the polka dots on the back, but they actually can have several different color schemes depending where you are in the country. It's not just the adults that are excellent predators, it's that immature. Here you can see that grayish alligator-like larva with some of those orange dots on the back. When I think about the different species, one that jumps out to me is convergent ladybug. This is one of them that can feed 300 aphids per day in some circumstances. Finally, I wanted to bring up the parasitoid wasp. You saw an example of this already, but the parasitoid wasps tend to be more specialists in many cases, where they're really focused on a certain type of pest that they will really attack. They are oftentimes similar or slightly bigger in terms of the size in comparison to that pest insect that they're attacking. But here you can see 1 generation per year, developmental time 10 to 12 months depending on the species you're dealing with. You can see some of the common prey. As I mentioned, presence of the parasitic wasp, this is the one that Dr. Canola brought up. You're seeing the one for the wheat midge here across North Dakota. And as I begin to wrap up, I really wanted to put this out there. We host the Good Bugs Workshop annually in different areas of the state. Last year we hoped to be in the Watford City area, but one of our partners asked us to step back and go virtual. So with any luck, we'll be in this area again this year, hopefully in the Watford City area. Summer 2022, kind of be determined out in Watford City. Look for an official announcement to come really the end of March or early April to see if this is going forward. But I just wanted to show off that poster from a year ago for you to highlight some of the topics that we covered. This is actually a program we do with the NRCS, really targeted to growers to help boost populations of those beneficials at those sites. So with that, I would just like to say thanks for having me, and I can entertain any questions that might be out there. Yes?
You mentioned using MSO for the grasshopper control. Are you using MSO to get better coverage of the plants, or are we trying to get to grasshoppers?
So actually, Dr. Canola, would you know that? So the question was, the MSO, is that targeted for the plant or coverage of the grasshoppers when you tie that into that insecticide seed treatment? Oh, I'll come. Oh yeah, so the question was, for some of those insecticide seed treatments for grasshoppers, it targeted for the foliar?
Now, Vantacor is a foliar insecticide.
Yep.
Yeah. It's, well, yeah, it's mainly to increase the activity against the grasshopper, and, you know, you get better coverage as well, especially during drought when there's not a lot of moisture in the air. The insecticide droplets are usually smaller, so they can evaporate and not always reach your target. So, and then also with the Prochaska, it's insecticide seed treatment for wireworm. That one, the reason why we're so happy about it is it's actually kills the wireworm. We've had a buildup for years, probably 15 years or more, with our neonicotinoid insecticide seed treatments. And this particular mode of action is different. It actually kills wireworms. So we're very happy to have something, again, that kills wireworm rather than gives you the sickness. We call it a drunkenness, where the wireworm gets drunk and it doesn't feed on the seed for a while, but then once it gets better again, then it'll go back and start feeding on the seed. With the neonicotinoids that we've had, like the Cruiser, not that they're bad, they still help prevent wireworms from feeding, but they're not killing the population. So for the big picture, for the long term, we need to start reducing the number of wireworms in the soil, which has been slowly increasing over the last 15 years, especially out west here, where there's more wheat and no-till, which is attractive for the adult click beetle, which the female is attracted to grassy fields for egg laying. So I guess that's one thing I just wanted to make clear with the broflanolid, the Prochaska. It comes either as an insecticide alone or with four different fungicides. the F4.
Thanks, Dr. Knodel. And yes, I apologize. My mind is thinking Trax is seed treatment and Vandicor is that foliar. So. So the question is, how often should we be considering their seed treatment, considering the lifespan of the wireworms? So that's 1 to 3 years. So the best answer I'm going to give to you is it's going to be based on your sampling protocols, okay? So it might be something that has to revise every year, but after you apply it, again that fall, do some of those baiting traps, do some of that soil sampling, and that will be used in that conjunction of making the decision overall.
Have you done any work with mellow bait? You know what I'm talking about, where the disease on brand and the grasshopper control?
I am not.
You don't know if that's effective.
I don't.
Okay, any more questions for Travis? Okay, if not, thank you very much.
Mm-hmm.